Let's look at the last of our white blood cells, the platelets. Now you might recall we talked about these previously as fragments of megakaryocytes. So the fragment of a megakaryocyte, this was the whole, it's not a true cell, it's a fragment. Anyway, the platelets are going to be important in blood clotting. They do a few different things. They're going to release chemicals that are part of the coagulation cascade. They actually help form this temporary plug, and they're also able to constrict, to bring the sides of a wound closer together because they have actin and myosin. Let's look at how this works. So the process of hemostasis means stop bleeding, right? So for hemo, anytime you see that, you're thinking blood. And then stasis is like stationary. So we're going to stop the bleeding. Now we have 4 different phases in hemostasis. We'll walk through those. So the first phase is called the vascular phase. Right? And the vascular phase begins when a blood vessel is injured. Here we have a knife blade slicing through a blood vessel. But the injury is also going to occur to the lining, the inside lining of the blood vessel. The inside lining is made up of a simple squamous epithelium, and we refer to that in the cardiovascular system as endothelium. So the endothelium is damaged. And again, this is simple squamous epithelium. It just has a special name when it's here in the cardiovascular system. So this injury is going to cause the epithelium, the endothelium, to release endothelins. Endothelins are chemicals that are going to cause this vasoconstriction, right, the contraction of this blood vessel. And they also make this endothelial lining of the blood vessel sticky. Okay? And that's what's going on here in the vascular phase. This is followed by the platelet phase. Right? So we're still continuing in hemostasis. I'm just out of room for number 2. Look at that. Platelet phase. So in the platelet phase, platelets start sticking to the sticky endothelium. Okay. So we call that adhesion. And then once that sticky endothelium is covered, platelets start sticking to platelets. That's aggregation. So they adhere to the surface, and then they start to kind of clump and pile on top of each other, right? This is the formation of a platelet plug. And this is that temporary plug that's going to stop bleeding until we can get a true clot to form. The other thing that's going to happen at this time is these platelets are releasing a bunch of chemicals that are going to kick off our next phase of coagulation. So I'll say plus chemical release. Now the coagulation phase, if you're thinking this looks really complicated, it is. I don't want you to memorize this whole thing. I want you to know a few very specific things. One, I want to point out that there are two different pathways that join together into what's called the common pathway as to how we form an actual clot. The extrinsic pathway occurs when damage comes from the outside, like that knife blade. Right, so when it's an external injury. Okay. And what's going to happen is as platelets are releasing chemicals, one triggers the next, and look at this, they're not even in any kind of numerical order, they're just in the order that they were found, so we're not memorizing that, right? But this extrinsic pathway starts when there's external damage. The intrinsic pathway is triggered when there's endothelial damage. So the lining is being damaged, but maybe not the whole blood vessel. So this would be from things like some of the chemicals in cigarette smoke, hypertension, right? High blood pressure is constantly kind of tearing away at the endothelium, or even something like in diabetes, when you have uncontrolled high blood glucose, that glucose can damage these cells. So intrinsic pathway is triggered, damage from within. Right, to the endothelium. And again, things like hypertension, high blood glucose, cigarette chemicals, those sorts of things. So we're activating different pathways. Now, that's important because this is a physiologic thing. If you're injured, you should stop bleeding. This is pathophysiologic. This is going to be a big thing that's leading to atherosclerosis, this constant damage, clotting, those sorts of things. Now, they both get us to the same place. So in the end result is this common pathway. And really what I want you to know here is, remember we talked about fibrinogen as a plasma protein. This is produced by the liver, and remember the ogen ending means it's inactive. We need to convert it to fibrin, which are the fibers that are actually going to cause our true blood clot, right? To heal, to get this wound starting to heal. And the chemical that basically cleaves fibrinogen converts it into fibrin, is a chemical called thrombin. Previous didn't make sense. So thrombin, right here, cleaves fibrinogen into fibrin, and now we have a true clot. That's the coagulation phase. Our fourth and final phase is clot retraction. We mentioned this with the platelets as well, right? They are able to pull the edges of the wound closer together. Right? And this is because they contain the proteins actin and myosin. So just like in skeletal muscle, you have actin-myosin cross-bridging to pull, to shorten the sarcomere. That's what we're seeing here in platelets to retract the wound. Okay, that is the end of this actual hemostasis, stopping of bleeding. Now, stopping here wouldn't make sense permanently. So once that wound has time to heal, right, underlying tissues are able to undergo mitosis, regeneration, all those sorts of things. I'm going to add this fifth step called fibrinolysis. So once we're done with the clot, right, then we're going to go ahead and start lysing or splitting, breaking down the fibrin. So this is a really complicated process. It's life-saving. This is kind of the classic example of positive feedback. One thing triggering the next, right? And you're like cascading towards the end result. Again, lots of details there that you don't need to go into. You should keep in mind things like this clotting cascade. It's using all of these different proteins. So if you start talking about hemophilia, sometimes people can genetically be lacking the instructions to make a certain one of these clotting factors. Also keep in mind nutritionally, this does require calcium to occur properly, and it also requires vitamin K. Vitamin K is a fat-soluble vitamin. Your gut bacteria make a lot of that, or you can get it from some leafy greens, that sort of thing.